Hello everyone and welcome back! In the next 3 videos I will summarize the events of post-Unification Italy up until the events leading to World War I. The years in between the Unification and the first global conflict are quite eventful, so I had to divide it up into 3 parts. Don't click away just yet though, because Italian contemporary history is arguably one of the most interesting and brutal succession of events in European history. The only one that maybe gets close enough to us is France, but without further ado, let's roll the intro. Our story starts in 1861. The Italian kingdom had been formed and the Albertinian status was chosen as the constitution for the new kingdom. I have a whole video about it here, together with a guide on how the government actually worked. This brand new kingdom had a parliament, 21 million people, and a bright future ahead of itself. Except that only 2% of the Italians actually had the right to vote, and all of them were male, so about 7% of Italian men had the right to vote, and only about half of them actually did, so about 200,000, but I digress. The parliament was divided into 2 main groups, the historical left and the historical right. There were no parties at the time, so they were very loose in many ways. The historical right was composed by the northern elite, including landowners and the church, while the left was mostly made out of city elites, as in urban aristocrats and the middle class. It is important to note that each side also had its radicals. The right had the monarchists and the separatists, and the left had the radical republicans such as the Mazzini and Garibaldi supporters. These groups had little to no influence due to their small numbers and Cavour's isolation tactic of connubio. Cavour was part of the historical right, and as the first prime minister of the country, he was ready to make the right choices to lead Italy to greatness, and his first action was to die of a fever in June 1861. King Victor Emmanuel nominated another right-wing politician, called Bettino Ricasoli, to essentially finish what Cavour started, which was to add basically the cherry to the cake. This was the start of the rule of the historical right. He named the currency the lira and set up a bunch of administrative decisions, such as dividing the country in provinces and commune. Ricasoli's effect on the country doesn't look crucial, but it lasted long. The administrative divisions lasted until 1970, and the currency got changed only 19 years ago. This unfortunately is the end of the positive attributes of the historical right, since it gets awful from here on. Italy started the process of Piemontesization, which was essentially the enforcement of Piemont's law over the entire peninsula. Many of these laws led to drastic changes to the south. Their previous king spoke Neapolitan, had divine rights and hired mercenaries to do the fighting, but now the south had to deal with a king that lived far away from them, spoke a different language and imposed conscription. The South felt extremely underrepresented, so from 1862 to 1865, the South was in total chaos. Small rebel groups started to come up, such as the Brigantes, who were not linked in any way, shape or form to each other, but they seemed to go along with the local landowners, which was probably how mafia families started. The Italian government used force against them, and in 1863 passed the Pica law, yes, that's what it was called, which essentially put the Brigantes in a terrible position if they were caught. In 1865, the criminality rate dropped again, but so did the growth rate, since many Southerners were killed or moved to the Americas. In 1866, Italy helped Germany in the Austro-Prussian War and got Veneto from them. This raised the right's approval ratings, but the public debt was sinking due to the many military interventions down south, so they implemented the grain tax, which increased national poverty, but it paid the debt back some years later. In In 1870, Napoleon III was removed from his throne, and so the Papal State became defenseless after almost 9 years of diplomatic immunity. Italy declared war, of course, and conquered Rome. The man who led the invasion was the legend Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had tried to do just this several times before by enrolling random Southerners to his army. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but at least he succeeded in the end. The Pope was offered complete religious freedom and a small piece of land called the Vatican to run, but he refused and excommunicated whoever took part in the invasion. The Church wouldn't let this go up until 1926, when they finally agreed to recognize Italy. No one really cared, even at the time, since the Pope had become useless at this point, but the Pope demanded all the Catholics in Italy not to take part in the voting system, in a movement called the No Expedit, and so the number of people actually voting in Italy shrinked even further. In 1876, the right had lost most of its support, and when Prime Minister Minghetti could not make the parliament pass some of his laws, he resigned and the king chose the first left-wing prime minister in Italian history, Agostino Depretis. Depretis took this chance happily, and he tried his best in putting Italy back on track. His most respectable achievements are his education reforms and voting reforms. He extended the mandatory school year from 2 to 5 years and made voting booths accessible to whoever male could read and write, leading to 25% of the male population getting their voting rights as soon as the law was passed in 1882. He also abolished the grain tax and tried his best to push the southern economy back on its feet. Unfortunately, that never came to be due to two main reasons. The southern businesses could not compete in the national market with its northern competitors, and the 1880s suffered a major economic crisis all throughout the world, which made it impossible for Italy to export much of its resources. By the end of the decade, however, the industrial sector of Italy became overhauled to a modern-day standard, starting off well after the crisis. For a series of reasons such as France taking over Tunisia, the economic tariffs, and the will to expand its borders, Depretis realized that he needed to break Italy's isolation and to sign some peace treaties. In 1882, he joined the Triple Alliance with Austria and Germany, which was a defensive alliance which they will never end up respecting or following, but I digress. This was mostly done to piss off France, but it was still a nice move. Italy had gotten a good streak of luck, so they decided to push it by getting into some more trends such as colonialism. Italy's first colony was at the Horn of Africa, more specifically the Assab Bay. They bought the land in 1882, but in 1885 they decided to expand inland and get Eritrea. Italian troops kept on slowly pushing until 1887, when 7,000 Ethiopian natives massacred 500 Italian soldiers in Dogali. This slowed the expansion for a while, but not for long. Depretis didn't seem to care about colonies as much, so he was more than willing to let it go after Dogali, though I think he let it go a bit too hard, because he shortly got to the point that he let go everything, including living. In fact, he died that same year, and Francesco Crispi substituted him. Yes, that's his name. Francesco Crispi was a radical left-winger, which at the time meant he was a Republican. Those were the days. Anyway, he was a Sicilian who fought alongside Garibaldi in 1860. This sounds nice and good, but I want to remind you that he was basically a radical at the time. He is remembered for being very authoritarian and quite aggressive in his foreign policies especially. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I will talk about him in the next video. He deserves it, because he is a very interesting figure. Follow me next time as Crispi tries to expand colonial borders of the ambitious Italian nation. We will find out next time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.